Hi everyone, it's Gene Calderon here again with another teaching day. Today being Tuesday, we are going to look at what we like to call Tuesday equals Truth Day. And what we like to do on these days is we focus and we really look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and try to figure out is what we are reading the actual accounts of what actually happened with Jesus during his time here on earth. There are some skepticisms, there are some reasons that people doubt or try to discredit those Gospels, those accounts that we have about what really happened. And so it's important for us to be able to understand why we believe what we believe when it comes to reading those Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And again, I like to repeat those names because I think it's so important that we read them over and over and over again. They're probably some of the most important teachings that we could find from Jesus himself. And so it's important for us to be able to be very familiar with those accounts. Anyway, looking at the Gospels and trying to figure out if what we are reading in them is really authentic and credible, one of the techniques that textual critics will use when analyzing manuscripts or analyzing witness accounts is what's something known as embarrassing testimony. That is, when people testify about certain things that they themselves are involved in, they may try to protect themselves by conveniently leaving out some of the details that might be embarrassing or even hard to explain. And so in order to avoid all of that, they might just leave certain details out conveniently that later on when things start to arise that we discover, we start to ask, well, why didn't they put that in? Well, because they didn't want people to know the embarrassing facts that they might have tried to conceal. Does that happen in the Gospels? Did the Gospel writers cover things up or report anything that might have been uncomfortable for them to explain? And when you take a look at the Gospels, again, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you compare them with each other, you do find some embarrassing details in the Gospels. For instance, in Mark chapter 6, verse 5, it says that Jesus could only do a few miracles because of the little faith that the people had in the particular town he was in. Now that seems to limit Jesus' power. How do we explain that? And how does that really work for or against the testimony of Jesus? Again, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, it says Jesus doesn't know the day or the hour of his return. Again, that becomes hard to explain if we claim that Jesus really is God in the flesh, and yet here he is not knowing something when we understood God to be omniscient. He knows all things about all times and in all places. How do we explain that? Christian theology really doesn't have a problem in explaining this thanks to some of the other writings that we do read about, especially in Paul's revelation in the book of Philippians chapter 2. That actually gives some credibility to the accounts that we're reading. In Philippians chapter 2, it says, verses 5 through 8, "In our relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross." So this helps explain how Christ voluntarily and consciously limited some of his divine attributes. So when we come to questions like, why couldn't Christ do this? I thought he was God. What about that? I thought he was supposed to know all this and he was supposed to be God. Well, in Paul, we read that, Jesus did have certain limitations that Jesus Christ himself took on as he entered into time and space as a human being to experience things as we experience that he himself would now add on to his nature. So this explains how Christ voluntarily and consciously limited his divine attributes. And so it helps us explain what is really going on in those Gospels and why Christ seemed to be limited as a human being, but because it was not his full divine nature. Some other attributes would be that, well, what about Christ's baptism, and what about the crucifixion and all those other events? Those could raise questions too, which again would be able to be answered when we look at the Gospels or some of the other writings in the New Testaments. Now, the reason I bring all that up without having to explain it all or trying to explain it all is that if the Gospel writers, they really were just kind of playing around with history, it would have been more convenient for them to kind of leave all this stuff out than to actually go through the hassle of trying to explain it. right? If they just wanted to make it easy and not have to go through some of this embarrassing stuff, like, well, you know what? Somebody might ask us about why he didn't know. Somebody might ask us about why he was crucified. It'd be easier if we just left that stuff out. But they didn't. They put it in there. Why? Even though it was embarrassing, they wanted the truth to be revealed, right? There's plenty more details about Jesus and the disciples that could be embarrassing just on the surface, but when we take a better look at it, we can figure out the explanations. John's gospel, at the very end of his gospel, says that the whole world can contain all of the information about Jesus. So if they were leaving out certain portions of the account of Jesus, why wouldn't they leave out some of these difficulties, some of these embarrassing details? Again, it's because they're trying to share with us the truth. So here's the point. If they didn't feel free to just leave out stuff when it would have been more convenient or maybe even more helpful for them, is it really possible to believe that they started to add stuff in that would be more embarrassing for the account that they're trying to give? I don't think it is. Because the other option is maybe they were just trying to record the truth. As difficult as it may be, as hard as it may be to understand, because we're not dealing with just a man here. We're dealing with something that is divine, that is supernatural. And sometimes it's going to be hard to explain, but do we cover up where we're going to have difficulties explaining this? And I think the answer was no. They wanted to share the truth and follow the truth so that we ourselves would know the truth. And when we know that truth, it sets us free, right? Now, it takes a little time. It takes a little study. It takes a little explanation and teaching. But the truth is there in the Gospels that we are reading. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so I encourage you, read those accounts, ask questions, dig a little deeper, and it will blow your mind how accurate and how fulfilling those truths are. So again, I hope this helps you. This is Gene Calderon with Gene Calderon Apologetics Ministries, here serving Northwest Indiana as best as I can as a local missionary. I do work with Ratio Christi at Purdue University Northwest and serve as a missionary with that ministry, reaching out to students and the community on campus and around the local campuses here in Northwest Indiana. I also serve at my home church in East Chicago, Indiana, Sunday morning Bible studies or any kind of events that we do there. If you're interested in supporting me in any way, shape, or form, the links are down below. But hey, what do you think about the embarrassing testimonies? Did you ever consider that? Did you ever look at that? Are there some other examples that maybe you can think of and like to share? Bring those up. We'd like to take a look at them. But until then, we will see you again here with more teachings coming up soon. God bless you. Thank you so much for watching.